For weeks, negotiations for a ceasefire to end the war in Gaza, even temporarily, have ground to a halt. Then, last Friday, President Biden went public with a plan.
I want to give an update on my efforts to end the crisis in Gaza.
And this proposal, Biden said, was an Israeli proposal.
Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal. It's a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages.
This was a clear strategic step to pressure Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to act.
It's time for this war to end.
But Biden's announcement of this ceasefire plan surprised the Israeli public. Soon after, Netanyahu offered his own statement. He emphasized that Israel has two goals: the return of the hostages and the complete elimination of Hamas. Then, over the weekend, far-right members of Netanyahu's government threatened to quit if he accepted the deal.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, continuously been trying to juggle countering pressures both within his governing coalition, within Israel itself, and within the international community, particularly with Washington, where President Biden offered sort of unqualified support for Israel, but that also has begun to give way to a lot of pushback on the war in Gaza.
Steve Hendricks is the Jerusalem bureau chief for The Post. He has been reporting on the new pressures facing Netanyahu from outside Israel and from within, where protests to bring home the hostages continue.
There's a lot of anger that the government has failed to bring the hostages home or negotiate a ceasefire that might allow that. And there's just been differences since the beginning that have really, in the last, I would say, month or so, begun to split wide open. And it's become a real question of whether we're sort of at the moment now where he can't keep all these factions together.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers, and it's Thursday, June 6th. Today, Netanyahu at the crossroads. I talk with Steve about how Netanyahu is navigating this moment as he faces dueling demands over the next steps in Israel's war in Gaza. So, Steve, for months, we've heard about ceasefire proposals to try and end Israel's war in Gaza, at least temporarily. But then, as we said last Friday, there was this public announcement from Biden about Israel's potential ceasefire terms. Talk to me a little bit more about that deal and what the terms of that deal would be.
Well, he really shocked the Israeli political world when he announced that plan. Basically, because he said this wasn't a White House design, this was an Israeli plan that had been approved by the war cabinet here. And it was a complicated move on the president's part because essentially he was trying to force Netanyahu to do something that he's very reluctant to do, which is to take public ownership of some of these ceasefire proposals. They're not very popular in Israel, certainly among his right-wing base. That's a group of voters and politicians that really want to see the war against Hamas continued until, quote unquote, total victory, or until the group is really destroyed certainly as a fighting unit, but even as an organization that could come back to political power. So he had to immediately come out and say sort of two things at once. Yes, this is a deal that we've discussed and will put forward, but it's really being described in the wrong way by the president, especially when it comes to the terms on ending the fighting permanently in Gaza.
And I think the context that's important here is that there have been many ceasefire proposals on the table that have mostly failed. Why is this one a proposal that Biden decided to come out with publicly and talk about in this very public way? What's different here?
I think that's a mark of the frustration that the administration feels with with Netanyahu. There have been many proposals, and some of them aren't terribly different than the one that Biden described. But just the growing anger in Washington that Netanyahu refuses to do many things he seems to have promised to do on back channels, which is to deliver more aid, to hold off on going into Rafah. It's all just seemed to brought Biden to the point where he's trying this maneuver where he's trying to sort of publicly push Netanyahu to accept a proposal that Biden says came out of the Israeli government.
And was this something that we understand took Netanyahu by surprise? Like, did Biden basically come out on his own and be like, look, so just so everybody knows, here's what we've been hearing Israelis have been pushing for, and like trying to essentially like nail Netanyahu to this proposal in an attempt to get it to actually go through?
Very much so. I don't know for sure whether there was any heads up to Netanyahu's office before the speech came, but it was definitely a surprise to Israelis I talked to, including some very close to the Prime Minister's office. They were very much caught off guard, and they thought it was very deliberate that Biden gave that speech on a Friday, which was after the beginning of the weekly Jewish Sabbath here, when many politicians are unplugged, most refrain from being public, and Netanyahu's office did release a statement about Biden's speech, sort of both acknowledging and disavowing that, but that really delayed the bigger reaction that came until, almost 24 hours later.
So then what were the actual terms of this proposal?
Well, in broad terms, it was for a ceasefire of about 6 weeks to begin with. And during the course of that ceasefire, almost all the remaining, meaning living, Israeli hostages would be released in exchange for a number of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. And if that continued to progress, there would be mechanisms for the ceasefire to be extended.
Israeli forces will withdraw from Gaza, and as long as Hamas lives up to its commitments, a temporary ceasefire would become, in the words of the Israeli proposal, the cessation of hostilities permanently, end of quote. Cessation of hostilities permanently.
And that's the part where the Israelis, especially Netanyahu's camp, care very much about how that is worded. They are not ready to say there will be a permanent ceasefire, that the hostilities, the war in Gaza will end. That has been the point that's brought down seemingly previous proposals in Cairo and Doha, and we'll see if there's a way for the negotiators to finesse that point this time.
And is this something that Hamas on the other side has agreed to already, or do we have a sense of whether they're like, yeah, that would be, those terms would be fine with us?
Well, we don't know because it isn't remarkably different than the last proposals that were considered to be very close to resolution in negotiations in Egypt. Israel says it was Hamas who declined to take the final step, and Hamas says it's Israel who refused to commit to ending the war. So it's both a matter of semantics. This is a very complicated, very emotional deal to be struck on both sides, and also substance. I don't know if Israel's at a point, or the prime minister is at a point where he's willing to say we have largely achieved our goals in degrading Hamas's ability as a fighting unit and a political force. He's still getting tremendous pushback, especially from his right flank and members of his own government.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit more about that. What do those concerns look like? Why is it that this proposal has so much backlash in Israel?
The idea of pulling out of Gaza or ending the war before Hamas is, quote unquote, destroyed is extremely unpopular with the right wing in Israel, including members of Netanyahu's governing coalition. They see a threat from Hamas of repeating the attacks on the lines of October 7th. They don't want Hamas to come back as the government of Gaza. It's very difficult for them to say this publicly, but, obliquely they say we'd rather keep fighting Hamas even at the cost of the lives of the remaining hostages. It's just a calculation that the greater interest of the country is in carrying out this war to, its extreme end. That's a increasingly unpopular position among centrist and certainly leftist Israelis and the families and advocates for the hostages.
And these families have been super public in their frustration with Netanyahu, correct?
Oh, yeah. And their frustration is really turning into fury. Their weekly protests are growing larger. We saw huge numbers out on the streets this past Saturday. That really is emerging as a massive public movement at this point.
And how is Netanyahu weighing those two things? Both the more conservative elements who are basically saying, no, we need to be able to continue to fight Hamas, versus the more moderates and the families of those hostages who are saying this should be your top priority to get the hostages home, even if that means agreeing to a permanent ceasefire.
Well, to veteran Netanyahu watchers, he's been handling it the way he has governed for many, many years. And that's to say with a lot of political maneuvering, and his MO has been consistent. He likes to put big decisions off. He likes to seem to be agreeing with lots of different points of view at the same time. And I think that's what's kind of brought us to this point where he has apparently signaled to the White House that he's ready for major concessions, for the delivery of more aid, for serious consideration of the ceasefire terms. And then at the same time, he's telling his right-wing political partners that, don't you worry, I'm not about to agree to anything that would end the war now. And so it just seems like after 8 months of that, we've kind of gotten to the point where all sides are pushing him to really declare his position. I think following Biden's announcement, you really saw the splits get wider.
What is your sense of the reaction from the American side, and specifically like from President Biden, from the White House, who have really allied themselves with Netanyahu at every turn, have gotten a lot of flack for the way that they have been pretty unequivocal in their support for Netanyahu. But it seems like in this moment, you know, they're sort of trying to lead him in a certain direction or trying to be a partner in this. And that, I don't know, I could imagine that they would feel like Netanyahu has sort of hung them out to dry.
Yeah, I would say that at this point, the main way I would characterize the administration's feelings is deep frustrations emerging into more and more open anger. Yes, they feel like they have been told numerous times things that would happen or change that never did happen or change. There's a lot of administration people who are saying privately that Netanyahu is delivering really difficult circumstances to Biden, who's, you know, in his own presidential campaign at the moment and facing increasing anger from his own party over his support, his unequivocal support for Israel in Gaza. They're pointing to a history in which Netanyahu has sort of not been a friend to Democrats, going back, you know, even before the Obama administration to the Clinton administration, and has tilted towards Republicans. So it's begun to feel like a partisan issue in the United States, and that's begun to translate into real anger at Netanyahu from inside the White House.
And based on that, is there any indication right now that we're approaching a point where the U.S. could withdraw support from Israel, or at least like take some definitive action that would demonstrate that like they are not on board with how Netanyahu is conducting all this?
It's hard to see what a big step like that would be. We do know that the president did pause the delivery of some large sort of bunker-busting weapons that he said he, you know, did not want to see being used in Rafah. But other weapons are still being delivered on a regular basis. You know, again, it kind of goes back to he really doesn't have a lot of latitude inside the Congress or in the country to do much more. So we're going to see a lot more of the same until one of these peace deals is finally approved. A lot of rhetoric and a lot of pressure from Biden, but hard to see what a material, you know, cessation of support would look like at this point.
After the break, we hear about the ultimatum that Netanyahu is facing within his own government. We'll be right back. So, Steve, I want to pause here for a second and just talk about the emergency war cabinet in Israel. Because from the little that I understand, this is like pretty different from how you would see a war cabinet in the U.S. Can you talk about like what this entity is and who is in it and why it's become so important in getting a sense of like Netanyahu's political future?
It is an extraordinary body. It grew out of the chaos in the days after October 7th, and it came from a recognition that the moment demanded the broadest possible political buy-in to this crisis from all parts of the political spectrum. So it includes Netanyahu as the prime minister and his right-wing government, but it also has members of the opposition, namely Benny Gantz, who is a leader of the opposition. He's Netanyahu's biggest political rival. They have faced off in numerous elections over the last several years. And he's a former military chief of staff, so he has a tremendous credibility when it comes to fighting a war. And so Netanyahu invited members of the opposition to join him and the defense minister as a three-person war cabinet. And it has largely functioned pretty well. There hasn't been a great deal of disagreement about the biggest choices, whether to go in with ground troops back in November, or more recently, whether or not to attack Rafah, which is a very controversial decision.
They were all aligned on that?
Yes, they were. They basically, as far as we know, big moves like that cannot be made without the approval of all three. But there's been plenty of disagreements that are becoming more public, and we're sort of wondering if now is the moment where it might actually crack up.
And tell me more about why those disagreements have started to become more public, and like what are the tensions behind the scenes?
Well, 8 months in, Israel has done a tremendous amount of damage inside of Gaza. The civilian death toll is just shocking. The effect on Hamas is obviously they're very degraded, but there's been a real sense in recent months almost now that maybe they're sort of plateaued. Hamas has been able actually to regroup in areas in northern Gaza that were previously cleared. We're now seeing rockets being launched from the north again. And that's led some members of the war cabinet to be more public and to say that without a strategic plan that looks at like what happens next in Gaza, Israel is just sort of falling into a quagmire. And that's the basis of the ultimatums that members of the war cabinet have presented to the prime minister.
And what have those ultimatums look like?
Well, the most specific one is from Benny Gantz, who says that Netanyahu needs to put out in public a fairly specific strategic plan for the governance of Gaza following the war. And this is something that Netanyahu has not wanted to engage with because all the options are difficult for him. If he were to agree with Washington's push to have the involvement of a sort of rejuvenated Palestinian authority, he risked having his most right-wing members of his coalition leave the government, which would collapse it and lead to new elections. So trying to pin him down on that has been difficult, and that has led Gantz to say, okay, the moment has come, let's hear your plan. That deadline is coming up. It's June 8th. We'll see if Gantz actually leaves the government, but the clock is ticking on that.
And I think it's important to understand here the politics of all this, too, because my understanding is that if Israeli elections were to be held soon, that Gantz could potentially beat Netanyahu in the polls, and that this is someone who is a real political threat to Netanyahu's future.
That has actually begun to change. It looks like Netanyahu has gained on Gantz. And a lot of political analysts here have been a little bit critical of Gantz and the way he's played the political part on this. His party actually put out a motion of no confidence in the parliament, something they actually have no way of passing at this point. They just don't have the votes for that. That cost him a little bit of support. And also the recent indictment by the International Criminal Court, which named Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant in particular, as well as Hamas, for possible war crimes, that sort of solidified a response in Israel. That was viewed as an unfair attack at a time of existential crisis for the country. That probably gave Netanyahu a little bit of a boost. So his fortunes, they shift a lot. He's still in great political peril, but maybe a little less than he was a few months ago.
But what would it mean if Gantz follows through on this threat and were to leave the war cabinet and pull his party from the coalition?
Well, it would not immediately bring the government down. Netanyahu still has a 4-seat majority in the Knesset, even without Gantz and his party participating. But Gantz's departure would undoubtedly galvanize what is a growing protest movement in the country. We're seeing increasing numbers of people out on the streets most Saturday nights in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other cities. That's a combination of hostage family advocates who want a deal to get the remaining hostages released, and the slowly rejuvenating democracy movement that protested mightily against Netanyahu's government last year before October 7th. Those two camps are sort of forming one angry opposition movement against the prime minister. That'll be jump-started in a big way if Gantz were to step down. That would be the end of this unity government, this sort of moment where all parties were pulling together, and kind of a return to the fractious politics of Israel otherwise.
And what is the prospect for an upcoming election? Obviously, this is a different kind of parliamentary system than the one we have here in the U.S., and it's not, clear when an election would happen. But what determines how that plays out, and how soon or how far away could a potential election be?
Well, Gantz and some opposition members have called for them to be this October. They said the 1-year anniversary of the attacks is an appropriate time for voters to have a new say. There's been a sort of deferred wish here to really look at what happened in October 7th, the security failures that let that happen, and hold someone accountable for it. Netanyahu is under pressure from all sides. He does have threats from his right-wing members that if he pursues the kind of ceasefire deal that President Biden described on Friday, they will pull out. If he seems to block another ceasefire deal, he's going to face even greater anger from the street, from the advocates for hostage families. So political observers here feel like the clock has begun to tick. And at some point, Netanyahu will probably decide to pick his own moment when he thinks he can do the best he can by running a campaign that will portray Gantz and others as quote-unquote soft on Hamas, and himself as a bulwark against the Palestinian state that much of the world is now pressing for.
And, the other thing that at least is on my mind is, we've seen here in the U.S. that Democrats and Republicans in Congress have invited Netanyahu to come and address Congress. I know there are a lot of strong reactions here to that invitation, especially among Democrats who have been so frustrated and angry about the course that this war has taken. But I'm curious from your point of view and from your reporting in Israel, how that potential speech is being seen among Israelis.
Well, among his supporters, it's seen as a good thing. He's, he likes to present himself as the kind of leader who's comfortable on the world stage like that, particularly in Washington. But it's also renewed a lot of criticism of him for playing partisan politics with Israel's relationship with the United States. You're right that invitation formally came from both sides of the aisle, but it was clearly part of the partisan wrangling in Washington when Republicans were pushing back on the president and any steps he took to hamstring Israel's war in Gaza. And here it's brought back the conversation that Netanyahu has tilted towards Republicans. This is reminiscent of the address to Congress he gave in 2015, opposing the then emerging Iran nuclear deal, which was considered an unprecedented and very sharp snub of the Obama administration. And so there are those here who are saying the relationship with Washington is one of Israel's greatest strategic assets. It needs to be handled carefully, and it needs to be maintained as a bipartisan support. And I don't think this speech, as what we're seeing about it so far, is likely to contribute to that.
Steve, what are the questions that you're asking going forward as you try to suss out how this is all going to play out?
You know, it was quite remarkable over the weekend to see Netanyahu come out and say, without accusing the president of lying, of saying, well, wait a minute, that's not quite how we see the quote unquote Israeli plan. And members of the opposition and members of the war cabinet even saying to Israeli reporters, yeah, it pretty much is. So the question we have is just like, where's the truth in all that? And, what is going to be the mechanism that finally breaks through this really distressing Groundhog Day of negotiations seeming to become promising and then just simply evaporating?
Steve, thank you so much for explaining all this.
Thank you, Martine.
Steve Hendricks is the Jerusalem bureau chief for The Post. While all of this is playing out in Israel, the situation in Gaza continues to escalate. Early Thursday, Israeli fighter jets hit a UN school in central Gaza. At least 40 people were killed, including many children. The school had been sheltering thousands of displaced Palestinians. Israel's military said it housed a Hamas compound. Weapons experts have reviewed verified footage of munitions fragments from the scene of the strike on the school, identifying them as U.S.-made bombs. And before we go, an update from Paris. The start of the Summer Olympics is less than 2 months away, but there isn't agreement on how to keep athletes cool. The dorms in the Olympic Village were designed to not have air conditioning. Instead, as part of the effort to make this the greenest Olympics ever, the plan is to cool them with a geothermal system of in-floor cooling pipes. But many of the largest competing nations at the Olympics, including the U.S., do not trust that this plan will be enough to keep their athletes comfortable, especially if there's a heat wave. So they are bringing in their own portable AC units, potentially enough for thousands of athletes. As our colleague Chico Harlan wrote, all of these power-sucking AC units will be way more of an energy hog than organizers had hoped, and will effectively undercut Paris's marquee sustainability measure. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. And if you're a subscriber to The Washington Post, there is another way to listen to our reporting. In our new podcast feed called Don't Miss, you can listen to Washington Post audio articles. Each episode is a different Post article, handpicked to bring you a good mix on the go. You'll need to be a subscriber to listen, so connect your Washington Post subscription in Apple Podcasts or subscribe at washingtonpost.com/subscribe. Today's show was produced by Emma Talkoff with help from Ariel Plotnick. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thank you to Leor Soroka. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.